You focused on yourself. You stayed quiet. You stopped explaining yourself to everyone who demanded an explanation. And somehow, against every social rule you were handed, everything started to fall into place. That should not have worked. Every message you have ever received tells you the opposite. Speak up, show up, be visible, be loud, stay in the room, even when the room is draining the life out of you. So why is it that the moment you went inward, the moment you chose silence over performance, everything began to shift in ways you cannot quite explain? Here is the question that should be sitting with you right now. What if the world has been lying to you about how power actually works? What if the loudest person in the room is not the strongest one, but the most afraid? Carl Jung figured this out over a century ago. And the answer he found is darker, stranger, and more personally demanding than anything you will find in a motivational video. It changes everything about how you see yourself, how you read the people around you, and why the silence you have been sitting in is not a retreat. It is a revolution. But let us not pretend this idea is comfortable, because the moment you start digging into what Jung actually meant, you are going to run into territory that most people spend their entire lives working very hard to avoid. Carl Jung was not a self-help philosopher. He was a Swiss psychiatrist and psychoanalyst who spent decades studying the deepest, most unsettling architecture of the human mind. He was clinical, he was rigorous, and he was completely uninterested in making people feel better without first making them feel worse. Because he understood something that almost no one wants to acknowledge. The reason most people are stuck is not because they lack information or opportunity or motivation. It is because they are running from themselves, and they are running very, very fast. Jung spent his career mapping the interior landscape of the psyche, and what he found was a structure that most of us have been taught to pretend does not exist. At the surface, there is what he called the persona. This is the mask, the social costume, the carefully assembled version of yourself that you present to the world. The persona is not a lie exactly. It contains real parts of you, but it is edited, curated. It is the self that gets applause, the self that fits, the social contract, the self that knows how to perform belonging. And for most people, the persona is so deeply established, so habitually worn, that they have genuinely forgotten there is a real person underneath it. Think about what that means in practice. The person who is always agreeable, always available, always performing warmth and competence and ease. The professional who has optimized every interaction for the outcome they want. The friend who always has the right thing to say and is exhausted by 10 in the morning from the effort of saying it. These are not bad people. They are people who have invested everything in the persona and left the inner self in the dark. And according to Jung, the inner self does not wait patiently. It waits dangerously. And it is worth understanding exactly how this happens. Because nobody builds a persona deliberately. Nobody sits down one morning and decides to spend the rest of their life performing a curated version of themselves. The construction of the persona is almost entirely unconscious. It begins in the earliest years of life and builds through 1,000 small moments of social feedback, each one teaching you which parts of yourself are welcome and which ones need to stay hidden. A child who cries and is told to stop being so sensitive does not simply stop being sensitive. The sensitivity goes underground. It becomes part of the shadow. A teenager who expresses anger and is punished or shamed for it does not lose their anger. The anger gets buried. It becomes denser. A young adult who expresses an unconventional desire or an unpopular opinion and gets rejected for it does not abandon the desire or the opinion. They learn to hide it. They learn to wear the version of themselves that keeps people close. And they become so practiced at it, so fluent in the language of the persona, that by the time they reach adulthood, the costume feels like a skin. This is what makes Jung's framework both deeply compassionate and deeply demanding at the same time. He understood that the persona is not a character flaw. It is a survival mechanism. But he also understood that a survival mechanism built for childhood becomes a prison in adulthood. The threats that originally required the mask are largely gone. The capacity to tolerate disapproval, to bear rejection without collapsing, to be genuine in the face of someone else's discomfort has grown. But the strategy remains. The habit of hiding persists. And so the person who is fully capable of being real continues to perform, not because they have to, but because they have forgotten that they ever had a choice. Here is where the story takes the turn most people are not expecting. Because beneath the persona, in the territory that the mask is designed to keep hidden, lives what Jung called the shadow. This is the unconscious part of the personality. Not a metaphor, not a vague concept. Jung meant it literally, clinically, precisely. The shadow is the repository of everything you have rejected about yourself. Every impulse you were taught was unacceptable. Every emotion you learned to suppress before it could make you vulnerable. Every desire you buried because it did not fit the version of yourself you were building for public consumption. The shadow contains your rage, your envy, your hunger, your contradictions, the grief you have never let move all the way through you. The ambition you pretend is merely dedication, the fear you have relabeled as caution. And Jung's most confronting insight, the one that makes people genuinely uncomfortable when they understand it, is this. The shadow does not get weaker because you ignore it. It gets stronger. It gets denser. He wrote that everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. Now the natural question is, where does the shadow come from? How does this happen to a person? Because nobody wakes up one morning and decides to bury half their psyche. It is a gradual process, and it begins almost universally in childhood. From the earliest years of life, children receive clear signals about which parts of themselves are acceptable and which are not. Show your excitement, but not your anger. Be ambitious, but do not seem too hungry for power. Be warm, but do not need too much warmth in return. Be sensitive, but do not be too sensitive, because that will make people uncomfortable. These signals come from parents, from teachers, from peers, from culture at large, and they are powerful. Because as a child, belonging is survival. Rejection is catastrophic. So you learn to hide the parts that threaten belonging. You learn to perform the parts that guarantee it. You build the persona, not as a choice, but as a survival strategy. The problem is that you carry that survival strategy into adulthood, long after the original threat has passed, long after you have the resources and the capacity to actually tolerate disapproval. Empaths aren't broken, they're alchemists in progress. The Alchemist's Path gives you drills, Jung-based boundaries, and 3 exclusive chapter videos to turn overwhelm into clarity. By Surreal Mind, 236-page downloadable ebook, in stock. Begin now at thesurrealmind.com. The persona solidifies, the shadow deepens, and you arrive in your adult life wearing a costume you forgot you put on, running from a monster you can no longer even name. What happens to all that ignored interior energy? It goes somewhere. It has to. And the place it most reliably goes is outward. Jung called this projection. When the parts of yourself you cannot face remain in the dark, your mind does something clever and cowardly at the same time. It locates those parts in other people. You become furious at the colleague who takes credit for shared work, and somewhere below the surface of that fury is a buried desire for recognition that you have never allowed yourself to claim. You become contemptuous of the person who is openly needy, and somewhere below that contempt is a need of your own that you have spent years pretending does not exist. You find certain types of people inexplicably, almost irrationally irritating, and the irritation has a heat to it that is not entirely about them. Jung observed this pattern across thousands of clinical hours and across his own interior experience. Everything that irritates us about others, he noted, can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. This is not a feel-good principle about empathy. It is a precise psychological observation about the mechanics of the unconscious. The qualities that charge us most, the ones that produce a reaction disproportionate to the situation, are almost always the qualities we carry inside us, unacknowledged, unintegrated, running in the background like a program we forgot we opened. And this is the foundation of why noise is so dangerous. Not noise in the acoustic sense, noise in the existential sense, the constant busyness, the constant scrolling and talking and reacting and producing and performing and filling every available gap with activity and content. All of that noise has a function, and the function is avoidance. It is an incredibly effective strategy for never having to sit with yourself long enough to hear what the shadow is trying to say. Consider the culture we are swimming in right now, a culture that has built entire platforms around the idea that your visibility is your value, that the more you share, the more you post, the more you broadcast your inner life to strangers, the more real and important and connected you are. Jung would not have been surprised by this. He would have recognized it immediately as a collective expression of the same individual pattern he spent his career studying, a civilization-wide persona, a social surface that grows more polished and more relentless as the shadow beneath it grows darker and more unmanageable. And here is the consequence that follows from this dynamic. When your entire identity is tethered to external response, when your sense of self is built on approval from people who largely do not know you, you become extraordinarily fragile in the places no one can see. Because the thing about a borrowed identity is that it requires constant maintenance. The performance cannot stop. The approval must keep coming. And the moment it slows, or the moment life delivers a disruption that the audience cannot follow you through, you have nothing underneath to stand on. The persona cannot carry you through a real crisis. Only the real self can do that. And you have not met the real self yet. When your external validation structures collapse, and at some point for every person they do, the experience is not just painful in the ordinary sense. It is existentially destabilizing. Because the question that surfaces in the silence is not just, what do I do now? It is the far more terrifying question, who am I without all of this? Without the role and the reactions and the approval and the performance? Who is actually here? Jung called the process of answering that question individuation. It is arguably the most important concept in his entire body of work. Individuation is not self-improvement. It is not optimization. It is not becoming a better, more productive, more admired version of the persona. Individuation is the lifelong, often painful, always profound process of becoming whole, of integrating the light and the shadow, of moving from the constructed self to the real self. And it begins, almost without exception, with silence. Jung was deeply personal about this. He did not theorize about individuation exclusively from a clinical distance. He lived it, and the period during which he lived it most intensively is one of the most instructive chapters in the history of modern psychology. After his public break with Sigmund Freud in the early years of the 20th century, Jung went through what he himself described as a long, sustained confrontation with the unconscious. He reduced his professional commitments. He withdrew from the public intellectual life he had built at considerable effort. He went inward, deeply and deliberately, spending years in a process of interior examination that was, by his own account, disorienting, frightening, and ultimately the source of everything truly original in his thinking. The record of that period survives. Jung documented his interior encounters in a private journal that he worked on for over a decade, and that was not published until decades after his death. He called it the Red Book. It is filled with illustrations he painted himself, visions he experienced in states of deep introspection, dialogues he conducted with figures that arose from his own unconscious. To the outside world during this period, Jung appeared to have retreated, to have slowed down, to have gone quiet. Inside, he was doing the most productive work of his extraordinary life. The work that gave birth to the concepts of the shadow, the persona, the collective unconscious, and the individuation process, all of which have shaped psychology, philosophy, literature, and popular culture in ways that are still unfolding today. He also built a private retreat at Bollingen, a stone tower on the bank of Lake Zurich, constructed largely with his own hands over several decades. He went there alone. He cooked over an open fire. He carved inscriptions into the stone walls. He drew and painted his inner visions. And he wrote about solitude in terms that carry no ambivalence whatsoever. Solitude is for me a font of healing, which makes my life worth living. Talking is often a torment for me, and I need many days of silence to recover from the futility of words. This is not the statement of a man who retreated because he could not handle the world. This is the statement of a man who understood that the most important work of a human life cannot be done while performing for an audience. What Jung found during those years of deliberate silence was not escape. It was confrontation. The unconscious, when you stop drowning it out with noise, does not politely wait its turn. It insists. It presents images, impulses, patterns, and internal figures that demand to be understood. Jung discovered that the psyche is not passive. It is an active, creative, sometimes overwhelming presence. And the only way to work with it, rather than be controlled by it, is to pay it the sustained attention that the world of noise and performance makes almost impossible. He also discovered something that changed the direction of his entire career. He found that the unconscious is not merely a repository of repressed pain, as Freud had largely argued. It is also the source of creativity, of genuine wisdom, of the symbolic and mythological patterns that human beings have been expressing in art and religion and storytelling across every culture throughout history. He called this reservoir the collective unconscious, the deep layer of the psyche that contains not just your personal history, but the accumulated symbolic inheritance of the entire human species. This discovery has enormous practical implications for the question of what happens when you go silent and focus inward, because what you are entering in those quiet spaces is not just your personal psychology. You are entering something much larger. When you stop filling every space with noise and reaction, when you create the conditions for genuine interior attention, you begin to access a layer of intelligence, creativity, and self-knowledge that the performing, optimizing, persona-maintaining self cannot reach. And this is one of the reasons that people who commit to periods of genuine silence and self-focus often emerge from those periods with a creative originality, a clarity of direction, and a sense of purpose that no amount of strategic planning or external optimization could have produced. The silence was not passive. The self-focus was not selfish. It was the condition under which the shadow could be faced, the projections could be withdrawn, and the real self could begin to emerge. And the work that emerged from those years of deliberate interiority was work of a depth and originality that his noise-filled professional life could never have produced. Now let us talk about the mirror effect, because this is where the personal becomes practical and where most people start to feel the ground shift beneath them. The mirror effect, as understood through a Jungian lens, is the phenomenon by which your most intense reactions to other people are maps of your own interior, not in a vague, everything is a reflection way, in a specific, traceable, sometimes genuinely shocking way. Consider a narrative illustration grounded in observed patterns of psychological projection. Imagine a person who becomes almost uncontrollably angry when they witness someone being publicly praised for work that seems to them ordinary or undeserved. The anger is immediate. It is out of proportion to the situation. It lingers. This person tells themselves the story that they are simply responding to injustice, that they have high standards, that they care about merit. But if they are willing to stay with that reaction, rather than immediately finding a story that makes it about the other person, they will start to find something else underneath. A hunger for recognition that has never been fed. An ambition that was taught to be ashamed of itself. A need to be seen that learned to disguise itself as a contempt for people who seek to be seen. The mirror is not flattering, but it is honest. And its honesty is the beginning of freedom. Because once you see the projection for what it is, it loses its grip. The other person is still the same. The situation is still the same. But you are no longer being controlled by an unconscious pattern. You have made the unconscious conscious, which is, as Jung famously understood, the only reliable way to stop that unconscious content from directing your life while you watch helplessly and call it fate. This is one of the most practical results of the inward turn. When you are no longer projecting, your relationships transform. Not because the people around you changed, but because you stopped using them as screens onto which you played out your own unresolved interior drama. You start to see them more clearly, as separate people with their own interior lives, their own shadows, their own projections running. And from that clarity comes a quality of presence that is rare and unmistakable. You stop reacting and start responding. You stop performing and start listening. You become, in the most genuine sense, available. Not because you have more energy, but because you are no longer spending all of it on maintenance of the persona and management of the shadow. But it is important to be honest about what shadow work actually looks like in practice. Because there is a version of this conversation that makes it sound easy and almost pleasant, like a Sunday afternoon of journaling and candles and peaceful self-reflection. That is not what Jung was describing. The encounter with the shadow is uncomfortable. Sometimes it is genuinely shocking, because the shadow holds the parts of yourself you have decided you are not, the parts you have convicted without trial and locked away. And when you start opening those doors, what you find is sometimes not what you expected. You may find resentments you did not know you were carrying, beliefs you absorbed from the culture around you that are running your decisions from underneath. Fears you have been performing courage over for so long that you forgot the courage was a performance. You may find grief, old grief, grief that has been waiting for decades for the right conditions to finally move. You may find rage that, when you stop running from it, turns out not to be about the things you thought it was about. And here is the crucial thing that separates the person doing genuine interior work from the person simply retreating into avoidance. The genuine work is a movement toward the uncomfortable truth, toward the fuller picture of yourself, toward integration rather than isolation. It is harder and more demanding and less immediately rewarding than filling the same hours with distraction, but it is the only process that actually changes the foundation rather than just redecorating the surface. Consider another composite example based on patterns documented across Jungian clinical literature. A person who has spent years being the emotional caretaker in every relationship. They are the one who organizes, who mediates, who holds space, who never asks to be held. They are described by everyone around them as strong, reliable, a rock, and they believe it. Until a period of their life strips away the usual structures, and they are left alone with themselves for the first time in memory. And what they find in that silence is not strength, it is terror. It is a person who has so thoroughly built their identity around being needed by others that they have no idea who they are when no one needs them. The persona was caretaker. The self was a stranger. This is not a small discovery. It is the beginning of the most important journey of that person's life, the journey Jung called the inward turn, the willingness to sit with the terror until it becomes something more workable, the willingness to ask, possibly for the first time, what do I actually want? Not what do I think I should want, not what has been approved and admired and rewarded in me. What do I, the actual person underneath all the performance, actually want? The answer rarely comes immediately. Jung did not promise a quick process. He promised an honest one. And the honesty, which is what the silence makes possible, is what produces the transformation that from the outside looks inexplicable. The person who comes out of a genuine period of self-focus and silence is different in a way that is felt rather than seen. There is a quality of groundedness, of settledness, of someone who is genuinely at home in their own body and mind, someone who does not need the room to validate their presence in order to remain steady. This quality is sometimes described in behavioral contexts as the predator's instinct. The observation that certain people, certain leaders, certain figures who carry a particular kind of authority move through the world with an unhurried, self-contained energy that draws attention precisely because it is not seeking attention. They do not need to fill the silence. They do not need to explain themselves constantly. They do not fidget under scrutiny or perform calm. They simply are, in a way that most people around them, who are busy performing their own versions of composure, cannot quite replicate. From a Jungian perspective, this quality is not a technique. It cannot be faked or practiced as a social skill. It is the natural result of a person who has done a significant portion of the work of individuation, who has met their shadow rather than running from it, who has withdrawn enough of their projections to see clearly, who has let the persona become something they can choose to wear rather than something that wears them. That quality of realness, of psychological solidity, is not manufactured. It is earned in the silence, in the hours and days and sometimes years of honest interior work. There is another dimension to this that does not get discussed enough. Jung wrote extensively about what he called the second half of life, and he saw it as a fundamentally different psychological territory from the first. In the first half, the primary task is building the ego, constructing the structures of identity, career, relationship, and social function. This is necessary work. The ego is not the enemy. It is the necessary foundation. But if you are still doing first half work in the second half of your life, if you are still purely focused on building the external structure, still performing the persona, still running from the shadow, still looking outward for a self that can only be found inward, then something essential is being missed. Jung saw the second half of life as the invitation to go deeper, to ask harder questions, to stop optimizing the performance and start excavating the person. And he observed, across decades of clinical work, that the people who initiated this inward turn earlier, who chose the interior path before life, forced it on them through loss or failure or illness or sudden, disorienting solitude, gained a quality of depth and authentic authority that simply could not be replicated through continued outward achievement. Because here is the final uncomfortable truth that all of this has been building toward. The world does not need more noise. It is drowning in noise. What the world responds to, what it is genuinely hungry for, even when it cannot name it, is realness, is depth, is the presence of someone who has done the hard, unsexy, invisible work of facing themselves and coming out the other side more whole, more honest, and more human. And there is a practical dimension to this that goes beyond personal peace and quality of relationships. When you have done a significant amount of interior work, your decision-making changes, fundamentally. This is not widely discussed in the context of Jungian psychology, but it is one of its most concrete practical outcomes. When you are running primarily from your persona, your decisions are largely made from the outside in. You make choices based on what will be approved, what will be seen positively, what will maintain the image you have invested in building. That is not weakness. That is what happens when the unconscious is driving and you do not know it. But when you have spent real time with yourself, when you have met some of your shadow and integrated some of your projections, your decisions begin to come from a different place, from actual values rather than borrowed ones, from genuine priorities rather than performed ones, from the whole self rather than just the managed surface. And the decisions that come from that place are cleaner, more consistent, harder to manipulate from the outside, because they are not calibrated to anyone else's approval. They are calibrated to something internal, something stable, something that does not shift every time the social weather changes. This is part of what gives people who have done genuine interior work that quality of authority that others notice without being able to name. It is not confidence in the performed sense. It is not bravado or strategic positioning. It is the natural result of a person whose inner and outer life are reasonably aligned, who is not spending enormous amounts of psychic energy managing the distance between who they are and who they are pretending to be. That energy gets freed up, and it becomes available for everything else, for clarity, for creativity, for genuine presence, for the kind of work that only comes from someone who is actually there. Jung called the ultimate goal of individuation wholeness, not perfection. Not the removal of the shadow, but the integration of it, the acceptance of your full complexity, the willingness to carry your own contradictions without needing to resolve them for an audience. And when you reach even a fragment of that wholeness, it shows, not in your follower count or your highlights, in the quality of your attention, in the steadiness of your presence, in the way you listen without waiting to perform, in the way you tell the truth without needing it to land a certain way. The people in your life feel the difference. The ones worth keeping get closer. The ones who are only there for the performance start to drift away. Your work gets more original. Your decisions get cleaner. Your relationship with yourself gets, for perhaps the first time, genuinely kind. Not the performed self-kindness of affirmations and gratitude journals, but the real thing, the kindness that comes from actually knowing yourself well enough to treat yourself honestly. This is what happens when you focus on yourself, not in the shallow, curated, here is my morning routine sense, in the Carl Jung sense, in the descent into the interior sense, in the sitting with your own shadow until you are no longer afraid of it sense, and the silence. The silence that everyone around you will misread as avoidance or arrogance or eccentricity. That silence is not emptiness. Jung himself said it plainly. Solitude is a font of healing. The silence is where the work happens. It is where the persona cracks and the real person starts to breathe. It is where the projections fall away and you start to see clearly. It is where the unconscious becomes conscious and fate begins to feel like a choice. So when you chose to go inward, when you chose to stay quiet instead of performing, when you chose to focus on yourself instead of chasing everyone else's definition of what your life should look like, you did not take the easy way out. You took the hardest path available, and that is exactly why it worked. Jung once wrote that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. Not who you were told to be, not who your fear settled for, who you truly are. And that privilege is earned in the silence, in the stillness, in the long, patient, courageous work of going inward, when every external force is screaming at you to go outward. You have already started. You are already further along than you think. And the fact that you are here, sitting with these ideas, asking these questions, suggests that something in you already knows what Carl Jung spent a century trying to tell the world. The most important journey you will ever take has no audience. It has no applause at the finish line. It happens in the quiet, in the dark, in the in-between spaces where you finally stop performing long enough to meet yourself. And when you do, everything changes, even when it should not work, especially when it should not work. There is one more thing I want to talk to you about before we close, because it is the piece that connects everything. It is the reason the title of this video is not just a motivational phrase, but a genuine psychological observation. The reason why this approach should not work, by every conventional metric, but consistently does. The standard model of success in most areas of life, in career, in relationships, in creative work, in social standing, is built on visibility, on activity, on the accumulation of external proof. And there is truth in that model. You cannot achieve things you never attempt. You cannot build relationships you never invest in, but the model is incomplete. And the incompleteness is precisely where the Jungian insight lives. Consider a composite illustration based on a pattern seen across many different kinds of high-functioning individuals. A person who has spent years producing, performing, networking, optimizing, doing everything the conventional model prescribes. They are by all visible measures successful. But they hit a wall. Not a practical wall, not a wall of opportunity or resources, but an interior one. A sense of emptiness behind the accomplishment, a persistent feeling that something is missing from the version of their life they have built. That feeling, that specific feeling of achieved success and interior vacancy, is one of Jung's most reliable diagnostic markers. It is the signal that the persona has been very effectively developed and the self has been very effectively neglected. Now compare that with what happens to a person who takes the turn inward at that moment, instead of doubling down on the external, who sits with the discomfort instead of immediately replacing it with the next goal, who uses the vacancy not as a failure to be solved, but as information to be studied. What typically happens is this: the outer pace slows, the quantity of output often reduces, the person becomes quieter, less reactive, less visible in the ways the conventional model would measure. And from the outside, it can look like stagnation, like loss of momentum, like retreat. But underneath, something is being built that has no equivalent in the external world. The person is developing what might be called psychological integrity, a coherence between the inner and outer self that does not require constant management because it is not built on a gap. When they speak from that coherence. When they create from it. When they lead from it. And the quality of what comes from that place is different. It does not have the slightly anxious energy of someone performing excellence. It has the quieter, steadier quality of someone actually being excellent and knowing it and not needing to announce it. Jung understood this dynamic as the natural result of what he called the transcendent function, the capacity that develops through genuine interior work for the conscious mind and the unconscious to work together rather than in opposition. When the persona and the shadow are in constant unconscious conflict, an enormous amount of psychic energy is consumed by the maintenance of that conflict. When the shadow begins to be integrated, when the projections begin to be withdrawn, when the persona loosens enough to allow the real self to breathe, that energy becomes available. And it shows in ways that are palpable and real, and that other people respond to even when they cannot explain why. This is the psychology behind what people sometimes call the silent power of those who seem to do less and achieve more, who are present in a room without dominating it, who influence without insisting, who are remembered without performing to be remembered. These are not magic tricks or social strategies. They are the natural byproducts of a person in whom the inner and outer life have come into genuine alignment. A person who has done the honest, uncomfortable, unglamorous work of sitting with themselves and finding out who they actually are. Jung spent his whole life mapping the path to that alignment. He was not always pleasant about it. He did not promise it would be comfortable or quick, but he was clear about what was on the other side. He called it the wholeness that a human being is capable of. And he believed, with a conviction grounded in decades of clinical observation and his own interior experience, that the pursuit of that wholeness is the most meaningful thing a person can do with the one life they are given. In The Alchemist's Path, perception training for empaths, you'll turn overwhelm into wisdom with practical drills, Jung-inspired boundaries, and step-by-step perception training. This guide includes 3 exclusive chapter videos to deepen each lesson. Written by Surreal Mind, 236 pages, beautifully designed 8.5 by 11 downloadable ebook, in stock now. Start your training today. Feel deeply while thinking clearly. Get The Alchemist's Path at thesurrealmind.com.